The royal palace of Windsor had always been a place of hushed voices and polished floors, a world where every glance was measured and every word was weighed. For Sergeant Major Alastair Finch, a 20-year veteran of the King's Guard, it was a world he knew better than his own home. His post at the entrance to the private royal apartments was considered a quiet one, a place of ceremonial duty more than actual security. The day had been unremarkable, a soft gray English afternoon, until the heavy oak door behind him burst open with a force that shattered the silence. He turned, his training instantly erasing the 15 years of age that clung to his bones. Standing in the doorway was not a threat, but a small, tousle-haired boy of 5. Prince Louis, the younger son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, stood clutching the doorframe. His face, usually a picture of cheeky mischief, was flushed a deep, alarming red. His bright blue eyes were swimming with tears that hadn't yet fallen, and his lower lip trembled with a betrayal too profound for his young years to articulate. Then he spoke. It wasn't a loud declaration, but in the profound quiet of the corridor it echoed like a gunshot. His small voice, thick with sobs, cut through the stale air. The man caused me pain. Sergeant Major Finch felt the world tilt on its axis. 20 years of service, and of standing rigid while tourists snapped photos and dignitaries passed by, and nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. A child of the realm, a prince, uttering words that triggered every single protocol in his manual and every instinct in his gut. He didn't see a prince in that moment, he saw a child in distress, and his duty was crystal clear. His hand moved to the emergency communication device clipped to his belt, a device he had checked daily but never once used in earnest. With a press of a button, he bypassed all standard channels and sent a priority alert to the palace's security hub. His voice was a low, urgent rumble into the discreet mic at his wrist. Sergeant Major Finch to Central Control. Immediate assistance required at the private apartment entrance. Priority Alpha. I have a child of the household reporting physical harm. Repeat, a child is reporting physical harm. He didn't use names. He didn't need to. And the code was enough to send a jolt of electricity through the entire palace security apparatus. As he knelt, the stiff wool of his ceremonial trousers creaking in protest, he brought himself down to the little boy's level. The prince flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and Alastair's heart clenched. He stopped his forward motion immediately, keeping a respectful distance. "Your Royal Highness," he said, not his voice stripped of its usual bark and softened to the tone he used to use on his own grandchildren. "My name is Alastair. I'm here to help. You're safe now." The boy just stared at him, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the invisible grime of a child's afternoon. The door behind him remained ajar, a dark, silent mouth leading into the private quarters. Alastair's mind was a whirlwind of terrible possibilities. Who was in there? Another guard? A palace employee? A visitor? He kept his body positioned as a shield between the child and that open door, his eyes scanning the corridor for any movement. The silence that followed was the most oppressive he had ever known. It was filled with the unspoken horror of the situation. He could hear the faint, distant tick of a grandfather clock somewhere, a sound of normalcy that now felt obscene. He placed his large, gloved hand flat on the cold marble floor, a gesture of stillness and peace. "It's all right. Lad," he whispered, the formal address gone. "Help is coming. You just stay right here with me." Within 90 seconds, a sound that felt like an eternity, the corridor at the far end came alive. It wasn't a chaotic rush, but a terrifyingly efficient, silent flood of dark suits. Plainclothes officers from the Royal Protection Command moved with lethal grace, fanning out and securing the area. Behind them, the heavier footsteps of uniformed soldiers. Alastair gave a sharp nod towards the open door. Two of the plainclothes officers melted into the shadows and disappeared through it without a sound. A senior officer, a woman with sharp eyes and cropped gray hair, approached. She didn't need Alistair to explain. She saw the kneeling soldier and the small, distressed child. "Sergeant Major, status." "Ma'am, the young prince exited the apartment approximately 2 minutes ago and made a direct verbal complaint of physical harm. He has not been left unattended since. The door has been secured from this side. 2 units have entered to sweep the interior." She gave a curt nod, and then her gaze fell on Louis. Her expression softened, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of humanity before the professional mask slammed back into place. "His parents are being informed. Medical is on its way." They didn't have to wait long. A clatter of footsteps, less measured this time, announced the arrival of the Prince and Princess of Wales. They were in casual clothes, suggesting they had been relaxing in another part of their extensive residence. The princess's face was pale, a stark canvas of fear. She didn't run, but her walk was so fast it was almost a glide. The prince was right behind her, his jaw set in a hard line that Alistair had only ever seen in photographs of the king. "Louis!" The princess's voice cracked as she fell to her knees, on her elegant dress pooling on the floor. She gathered her son into her arms, her hands running over his small body, checking for injuries he couldn't see. "Mummy's here, my love. It's okay." The Prince of Wales stood over them, a protective pillar. He looked from his son to Alistair. "Sergeant Major, report." "Sir," Alistair began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands that he hoped no one could see. The prince emerged from the apartment and stated that a man caused him pain. I initiated immediate lockdown and reported the situation. No one has entered or exited since." The prince's eyes, the same shade of blue as his son's, were hard as flint. "The man, did he describe him?" Before Alistair could answer, a soft voice came from within his arms. "The art man." Louis sniffled, burying his face in his mother's neck. "He was showing me the paints, but then he squeezed my arm. Really hard. It hurt." A collective, a sharp intake of breath seemed to suck the very air from the corridor. The art man. It could only be one person. A visiting artist, a renowned portraitist who had been commissioned to paint the family. He had been given unprecedented access to the private apartments to conduct preliminary sketches. He was there, right now, with Louis. The 2 plainclothes officers emerged from the apartment, their faces unreadable. Between them, looking bewildered and pale, there was a middle-aged man in a paint-stained smock. He held a sketchbook in his trembling hands. He looked from the armed guards to the kneeling princess to the imposing figure of the prince, and his face crumpled. I don't understand," he stammered. "I was just showing him the cobalt blue. He was reaching for it. I gently took his arm to stop him from knocking over the turpentine. I barely touched him. I swear." The air crackled with tension. The story had just begun, and already there were 2 starkly different versions of a single, fleeting moment. The arrival of the palace doctor created a momentary diversion, a chance to usher the crying Prince Louis and his mother away from the charged atmosphere of the corridor. The Prince of Wales remained, a statue of restrained fury, his gaze alternating between the frightened artist and the stoic sergeant major. Alistair was instructed to remain, his account now a crucial piece of a puzzle no one had expected to assemble. And the artist, whose name was Julian Thorne, was escorted not to a cell, but to a small, elegant sitting room nearby. It was a room meant for quiet audiences, not interrogations. He was offered tea, which he refused with a shaking head. He was not under arrest, he was informed, but his cooperation was required. The phrasing was polite, but the presence of 2 large protection officers by the door made the reality of the situation abundantly clear. Meanwhile, in a different part of the palace, and a quieter but equally intense scene was unfolding. In the prince and princess's private sitting room, Louis was curled on his mother's lap, a glass of warm milk in his small hands. The doctor, a gentle, silver-haired man who had cared for the royal children since birth, had finished a preliminary examination. He found no visible bruising, no physical mark. He spoke in low, soothing tones to the parents. "Children's pain can be subjective," he explained carefully. "A grip that seems firm to an adult can feel overwhelming to a small child, especially in a moment of surprise or fear. Emotionally, he seems more distressed by the shock of the event than by any lasting physical hurt. My recommendation is rest and reassurance." The princess hugged her son tighter, relief warring with a mother's protective anger. The prince listened, his expression unreadable. The doctor's words were reasonable, professional, but they didn't erase the image of his son's tear-streaked face, or the simple, terrifying statement, "He caused me pain." Back in the ornate sitting room, the interview with Julian Thorne began. It was conducted not by a police detective, but by the head of royal security, a man named Sir Geoffrey Parsons. He was a veteran of the intelligence services, with a face that gave nothing away. He sat across from the artist, his manner calm, almost conversational. "Mr. Thorne," Sir Geoffrey began, "can you walk me through the events of this afternoon from the moment you entered the apartment?" Thorne, a man more accustomed to the solitude of his studio than the glare of royal scrutiny, swallowed hard. "I was invited to begin preliminary sketches for the family portrait. I was working in the small sitting room off the main drawing room. The light there is exceptional. I had my materials laid out. I was focused on some compositional notes." He paused, running a hand through his thinning hair. Then the door opened. It was the little boy, Prince Louis. He just wandered in. He was very polite. He asked what I was doing. I showed him. He was fascinated by the paints, especially the tubes of bright color. Children are naturally curious. I didn't think anything of it. "And then?" Sir Geoffrey prompted gently. Then he reached for a tube of ultramarine. It was on the edge of the table, near a jar of turpentine. The jar was glass, heavy. If he'd knocked it over, the mess, the fumes, the potential for him to get hurt. Thorne's voice became more animated, desperate to be understood. "I just reacted. I put my hand out and took hold of his arm to guide him back. I said, 'Careful, young sir, that's not a toy.' It was a gentle touch, a brief touch. I swear on my life. He looked at me, and then he just pulled away and ran out. I thought he'd just gone to find his nanny. I had no idea. I never imagined." His voice trailed off, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of his situation. He was an artist, not a criminal. His reputation, his livelihood, everything he had worked for was crumbling around him based on the misunderstood words of a 5-year-old. Across the palace, the story was beginning to leak. The palace press office, a finely tuned machine, was already in damage limitation mode. A junior aide, flustered and overworked, had sent a vague, coded message to a contact at a major news outlet asking for discretion on a private family matter. The contact, a veteran royal correspondent, knew a scoop when he smelled one. Within an hour, the first whispers began to appear online. Palace incident involving young royal. Security alert at Windsor. The speculation was immediate and voracious. Sergeant Major Finch, having given his formal statement, was escorted to a quiet office. He was told to wait. He sat rigidly, eyes staring at the wall, replaying the moment in his mind. The look on the little boy's face, the tremor in his voice. It was the absolute, unfiltered truth of a child. He hadn't been coached. He hadn't been lying. He had simply been hurt, and he had run to the first safe person he saw. The contrast between the two stories was stark. On one side, a bewildered artist, a man of some repute, claiming a gentle, protective gesture. On the other, a traumatized child and a soldier whose word was his bond. And the investigation had only just begun, and already the lines were drawn. It was a classic he said, she said, but with the unimaginable weight of the crown pressing down on one side of the scale. The palace corridors, once so quiet, now hummed with the electric current of a crisis that had the power to wound not just a family, but an institution. The hours that followed were a strange, suspended purgatory for everyone involved. The Prince and Princess of Wales retreated further into their private world, a protective bubble around their son. Louis, after a long nap, seemed to recover some of his usual spirit. He played with his toy trucks on the rug, the incident seemingly filed away in the forgetful mind of a 5-year-old. But his mother watched him like a hawk, and his father sat nearby, pretending to read a report, but his eyes never leaving his son. The initial relief they felt was slowly being corroded by a creeping, insidious doubt. What if it was more? What if the doctor was wrong? What if a trusted adult had indeed hurt their child, even in a minor way? The trust that underpinned their world, the assumption of safety for their children, had been cracked. The story, as it always does, began to mutate and spread beyond the palace walls. The initial whisper grew into a roar. The tabloids, sensing blood in the water, I splashed with headlines like "Royal Boy's Terror" and "Palace Assault Probe." The more reputable broadsheets took a more cautious yet deeply inquisitive tone, asking questions about palace security and the vetting process for those granted access to the royal children. Social media, that ungovernable beast, was a firestorm of speculation. Commentators, armchair psychologists, and conspiracy theorists alike had a field day. They dissected the prince's body language in old photographs. I analyzed the artist's previous work for dark themes and turned a simple, ambiguous incident into a full-blown national drama. The pressure on the palace to release a statement, to name the man, to explain what had happened, was immense. Inside the palace, the investigation continued, but its focus had subtly shifted. It was no longer just about what happened in that room. It was about the stories now being told about what happened. Sir Geoffrey Parsons, a master of navigating these treacherous waters, had a new problem. The court of public opinion was already in session, and the verdict was being formed without all the evidence. The artist, Julian Thorne, had become a pariah. His name had been leaked, presumably by someone in the palace press office or a security official with loose lips. He couldn't go back to his London studio. Reporters camped outside his flat. His elderly mother had received a threatening phone call. A bewildered man was now a prisoner in the very palace where he had come to create art. Thorne was moved to a more comfortable but still guarded guest room. He was given food, newspapers, minus the front pages, and the ability to call his lawyer. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Anita Sharma, arrived within hours. She listened to her client's story, her face impassive. Then she requested a meeting with Sir Geoffrey. The meeting was tense, Ms. And Sharma was not intimidated by the grandeur of her surroundings. "My client has been tried and convicted in the press, Sir Geoffrey," she stated flatly. "His name and reputation are in tatters. He has been effectively held here for over 12 hours. Is he a suspect, or is he a witness? Because if he is a suspect, he demands to be formally charged or released. If he is a witness, he wishes to cooperate fully and then be allowed to go home." Sir Geoffrey met her gaze. Your client's cooperation has been and continues to be appreciated. We are still gathering facts. The welfare of the child is our primary concern." "Of course it is," Ms. Sharma countered. "And my client's welfare is mine. A child said something that was misinterpreted. There is no evidence of any crime, no marks, no witnesses, no history. Just the word of a frightened little boy against a man with an unblemished reputation. Yet this is a storm in a teacup that you have allowed to become a hurricane." Her words were a cold, hard splash of reality. She was right. Legally, there was nothing to hold Thorne on. The investigation, from a criminal standpoint, was going nowhere. The Prince of Wales, kept informed of every development, was faced with an impossible choice. He believed his son. Every fiber of his being wanted to protect him, to punish anyone who had caused him a moment's distress. But he was also a fair man, and the future king. He understood the concept of justice, of innocent until proven guilty. He saw the artist's frightened face in the security footage, a face that didn't look like that of a predator. He saw the reports of the death threats, the ruined career. That evening he had a long, quiet conversation with his wife. They talked about Louis, about what he had said and how he was now. They talked about the artist, about the mob mentality that had been unleashed. And they talked about their own responsibility, not just to their son, but to the truth. It was the most difficult conversation they had ever had, a conversation between parents and future sovereigns. The next morning, a decision was made. It was a decision that would infuriate some and appease others. It was a decision based not on the roaring headlines, but on the quiet, complex truth of the situation. Julian Thorne was to be released. There would be no charges. The palace would issue a carefully worded statement expressing relief that a full investigation had found no evidence of wrongdoing and thanking Mr. Thorne for his cooperation. It would also, in a subtle but significant move, reiterate its commitment to the privacy and security of the royal family and ask the media to respect that. The announcement landed like a bomb. The tabloids cried cover-up. The artist's supporters celebrated. The public was left more confused than ever, and Sergeant Major Finch, reading the news on a screen in the guardroom, felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The system had worked, he supposed. The truth, or at least the legal version of it, had come out, but he couldn't shake the memory of the little boy's face. That was a truth, too, a different kind of truth, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen much in his life, that this story was far from over. The final chapter would not be written by investigators or palace spokespeople, but by the small, unpredictable heart of a child. The days that followed the palace statement were a study in managed chaos. The immediate firestorm of the media abated, replaced by a low, smoldering resentment in some quarters and a smug satisfaction in others. Julian Thorne, shielded by palace security, was whisked away from Windsor to an undisclosed location, his career as a royal portraitist, and perhaps as any portraitist, in ruins. He had his freedom, but it felt hollow, poisoned by suspicion. For the royal family, the focus turned inwards, to the quiet, painstaking work of healing. Louis seemed to bounce back, his resilience the greatest gift of his youth. But his parents were changed. A new, invisible layer of security was woven into the fabric of their children's lives. Every visitor, every tutor, every person who came within arm's reach of the young princes was now subject to a scrutiny so intense it bordered on the paranoid. The easy, trusting atmosphere of their home was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level vigilance. The Prince of Wales, in particular, carried a new weight on his shoulders. He had made a decision based on logic and law, but a part of him, the father part, would always wonder if he had failed to protect his son. The Sergeant Major Alistair Finch was decorated for his quick thinking and adherence to protocol. He received a commendation from the king himself, a brief, formal ceremony in a grand room. He stood rigid, accepted the words of praise, and saluted. But the commendation felt like a footnote to the main event. He was also offered a promotion, a desk job away from the front lines. He declined. He was a soldier of the guard. His place was at his post. He returned to his duties. But the quiet corridor outside the royal apartments now felt different to him. The silence was no longer just silence. It was loaded with the memory of a child's cry. A month passed. The story had largely faded from the front pages, relegated to the occasional "Where Are They Now" piece or a cynical column about palace spin. The official narrative was in place: a misunderstanding, a child's overreaction, an unfortunate chain of events. It was neat, tidy, and accepted by most. Then, but on a drizzly Tuesday afternoon, the Prince and Princess of Wales did something unexpected. They invited Julian Thorne back to Windsor. It was a private meeting arranged with the utmost discretion. No press, no aides beyond the most essential security. It was held in a small, informal sitting room, the very opposite of the opulent spaces where such dramas usually played out. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken history when Thorne was escorted in. He looked older, thinner, and the experience having carved new lines into his face. The Prince and Princess rose to greet him. There were no handshakes, just a formal nod of acknowledgement. Louis was not present. "Mr. Thorne," the Prince began, his voice formal but not unkind. "Thank you for agreeing to come. We felt it was important." Thorne simply nodded, his eyes wary. He didn't know what to expect. Another interrogation. A veiled threat. The Princess spoke next, her voice softer. "We wanted to apologize, personally, Ike, for what you have been through. The press, the public judgment. It was a storm that no one could have predicted, and you were caught at its center." The simple, sincere apology seemed to deflate the last of Thorne's resistance. He sat down heavily in a proffered chair. "I never meant any harm," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was just showing him the paints." "We know," the Prince said, sitting across from him. "We believe you. The investigation was thorough. It concluded there was no malicious intent. But an investigation can't always address the human cost. It can't feel." A silence fell between them, filled with the ghost of that afternoon. It was the Princess who broke it, speaking of something they had discussed at length the night before. "We've also been thinking about Louis, about his perception of that day. He is 5. His world is small, and his feelings are big. Something that felt like a gentle grip to you. He could have felt like a painful squeeze to him, especially in a moment of surprise." Thorne looked up, a flicker of understanding in his tired eyes. "He wasn't lying," he said, a statement, not a question. "No," the Prince confirmed. "He was telling his truth, and you were telling yours. They were simply different truths, viewed from different sides of a single moment. This was the heart of it, the uncomfortable, ambiguous center that no headline could capture. There was no villain. Yes, there was no victim in the classic sense. There was just a collision of perception, a child's fragile reality bumping up against an adult's protective instinct. Louis had felt pain. Julian Thorne had not intended to cause it. Both things were true. The conversation that followed was halting, painful, but ultimately cathartic. They spoke of Louis's love of color, which had not dimmed. The Princess even smiled, recounting how he had asked for a new set of safe paints for his birthday. Thorne, and despite everything, managed a weak smile in return. He spoke of his own work and how he hadn't been able to paint since that day. The spark, he said, had gone. As the meeting drew to a close, the Prince of Wales stood and extended his hand. This time Thorne took it. It was a firm, equal handshake between two men who had been through a shared ordeal. "We cannot undo what has been done," the Prince said, "but we can acknowledge it, all of it. We hope in time, and you can find your way back to your art." The palace never released a statement about this private meeting. It was not for public consumption. It was a quiet act of humanity, a recognition that the neat official story was just a shadow of the complex, messy truth. Sergeant Major Finch, standing at his post down the corridor, saw the artist leave. He saw the tired slump of his shoulders, but he also saw something else in his face, a kind of peace, perhaps. Or maybe just the exhaustion that comes after a long, hard journey. And in his nursery, Prince Louis was happily painting a picture with his new, child-safe set. It was a bright, chaotic swirl of blues and reds and yellows. When his nanny asked what it was, he explained, with the perfect logic of a 5-year-old, that it was the man who liked colors. He didn't seem scared. He didn't seem traumatized. He had simply moved on, his truth already a fading memory, is replaced by a new canvas and a fresh perspective. The adults, as they so often do, were left to carry the weight of the moment, learning the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes, in the search for a villain, we forget that life is simply a series of misunderstandings, small pains, and the slow, difficult work of forgiveness. The royal guard stood watch. The corridors fell silent again, and a family, a man, and a soldier were left to ponder the day a little boy's cry changed everything, and nothing at all.